Welcome to the HTLL podcast. We are your co-hosts, Emily Hirata, Technical Advisor for Health and Nutrition,
and Tino Movuti, Technical Advisor for WASH.
Today, we are joined by Andre Alencar, currently serving as Coordinator of Social Projects and Emergencies with ADRA Brazil. Andre has lots of experience with emergency programming, and over the last several years has been involved with the implementation of projects focused on the needs of Venezuelan migrants that have made their way over the border by foot into Brazil. Andre is here with us now to share more on this topic, particularly regarding the health, nutrition, and WASH needs that he has witnessed through his work and what ADRA Brazil has been doing to address such challenges. Andre, welcome. It's nice to have you with us.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you, Tina, for having me here with you. And it's my pleasure to be sharing our experience with the whole network.
So to start us off, could you share with us how ADRA Brazil first got involved with implementing projects focused on Venezuelan migrants? We know many experienced crisis in Venezuela, which forced them to leave. But what was ADRA Brazil seeing once these migrants reached Brazil?
Oh yes, Tino. So it was actually the first time that ADRA Brazil had to really act on migration. You know, and probably our listeners, they also know that the migration crisis is not really a current topic in our region here in Latin America. But this time, we started our work in 2018 when the migration towards Brazil, of Venezuelans to Brazil, really got to this critical level. And we started out, as usually happens in Brazil, with, small initiatives, small projects, pretty much based on the church capacity, of the Adventist church capacity in the state of Roraima, which is the bordering state in Brazil with Venezuela. But as the crisis developed, we and our partners and the entire context really required for more structured response, then was when ADRA got involved. Our first project was in 2018, like I said, and since then our work has really changed form. We've been providing different kinds of assistance and always making this response adequate to the context, as it is actually a very dynamic one. Maybe I should also highlight here that when we started this work, we first began with mostly in-kind assistance, usually the distribution of food items or dry food baskets. I said before, the church really supported us in, even giving items for us to distribute of many kinds, hygiene items included. But we really saw the situation developing to a more complex crisis as the numbers just kept on getting higher. The number of Venezuelans arriving to Brazil through the border, it really caught our attention, and it was really time to make a response, not really provide with the most basic needs, such as food assistance, but also supporting the very migration effort of those populations that were arriving to Brazil. The state of Roraima is actually one of the poorest states in our country. The entire north region of Brazil is really vulnerable in a sense, and we saw, especially by the time in 2018-19, we saw a lot of people coming to Brazil with so much uncertainty. They really didn't know where they were heading to, what they would do when they got to the country, how they would be welcomed, or if they would be welcomed in the country. What would be the ways for them to live in Brazil? Obviously, I don't know if you guys know, but in Brazil we speak Portuguese. Venezuelans, they usually and more generally speak Spanish. So there was also the language barrier, and we could barely communicate. I said Roraima still is a very vulnerable state. So actually, how would the population in Brazil even greet them and provide them with the needs that they were arriving with was a big concern. And I think it happens in humanitarian crisis overall that it takes time to organize things. So we now have a very big structure that was put up by the Brazilian government that we call welcoming operation, in Portuguese Operação Acolhida, which pretty much serves as a coordination platform, and it provides with several tools for coordination with actors acting in the humanitarian response. But by the time that this entire work of ADRA in the migration started here in Brazil, we saw a lot of disorganization, and people didn't really know what to do and what were the needs. It really took some time to or to put together a structure that would allow a better response for the incoming population of Venezuelans. I'm happy to say that actually ADRA was a big part of this first effort, and it contributed a lot in the shaping of these coordination efforts here in Brazil. And the population that were arriving by then, we they were facing several violations of their rights. I remember that we had reports of many unaccompanied children. We still unfortunately have reports on cases of workforce exploitation, and the situation, especially in the bordering city of Pacaraima, that's the name of the city that borders Venezuela in the state of Roraima. People there were living on the streets. It took a while for the government, for other entities, UN agencies to create the first shelters. But by the first time, we would see thousands of people in the streets of this very, very poor city that's called Pacaraima. Emily mentioned in the beginning of this episode that people were migrating on foot, and the migration would not end at the moment they would cross the border to Brazil, but they would continue migrating because I mentioned Pacaraima is a very poor city, so they would keep on migrating into Brazil, if that makes sense. Going more into or going to other cities in the state of Roraima, especially the capital city that's called Boa Vista, and people would walk more than 200 kilometers just to get to the city of Boa Vista, and I'm talking about more than 40 hours of walking with children, carrying the few belongings that they had, but still, I think you guys can imagine the burden it would represent to this migrating population. So you see, they would come to Brazil by the time after many, many days of displacement. Comparing what we have now to what was then, there are a lot more services in support of that migration. But what I saw in my first time in the field, when I got to the north of Brazil, what I saw was actually thousands of families that would arrive to Brazil after weeks of walking from different areas in Venezuela. Well, and it was very unfortunate also that some indigenous communities, especially that are common to the Brazilian and to the Venezuelan sides, they were also dealing and facing some episodes of violence against them. So, I think I mentioned a lot of things that were happening, but I know you guys will understand and you will see how the picture was actually one of of a lot of difficulties and challenges that the migrating population were facing, and also challenges to the humanitarian response to be finally offered.
Thanks, Andre. That's a very vivid picture that you painted that describes the experiences of migrants on their journey eventually into Brazil. Weeks of walking and basic needs that they have, violence against them. It seems like it was a real big challenge that ADRA Brazil had to step up to. But from all that you've described, I imagine that there are some stark differences in the needs of migrant populations versus the needs of the host populations. What special health, nutrition, and WASH challenges did you find particularly unique to the Venezuelan migrant population in Brazil versus those of the Brazilian host populations? And how do you think ADRA Brazil addressed those special needs?
Well, Tino, it's important to highlight here that the migration affects the Brazilian population in different areas of Brazil also differently. When we talk about the north of Brazil, which is, like I said, a very poor region in our country, the host communities basically share the same challenges, the same needs that the migrating population face. Obviously, with the difference that they usually have more information, connections, and resources that would allow them a response of their own, which is not usually available to the people, especially those just recently arrived to the country. But and according to the differences, obviously, ADRA's response has always been an appropriate one for each context, for each reality. But when we talk about the Roraima, for example, what we see is a lot of food insecurity affecting both the host community and the migrating population. There is also an issue in terms of limited access to safe water, especially those communities in the rural areas of the north of Brazil. They will have eventually a lack of access to safe water. And when we talk about protection, I mean, I can only touch the surface of the issue, especially talking about the original populations, the indigenous populations in Roraima, in Amazonas. It's hard to speak with exact figures on how big the problem is of making sure that those populations will have the rights respected and promoted and defended, and they have access to it all, to all they should have access to, I mean. But when we talk about WASH, especially, what we saw affecting especially the migrating population is as they would arrive and they would settle in spontaneous settlement, as they ended up being called. The spontaneous settlements, they are basically improvised communities, with improvised kinds of construction and so on. They would obviously, because everything was put together with the few resources that would be available at the time and the place where they would try to settle, there was obviously a lack of potable water. They wouldn't have access to potable water because several of the areas were not connected to the water supply infrastructure of Roraima. They would also lack reservoirs to keep the water they would have access to, and the reservoirs that were available would not necessarily ensure safety to the water. The children would be playing in areas where there would be flowing of black water. I think that's how it is called. And it still is the case that most of those spontaneous settlement still deal with open sewage. The lack of water supply and distribution infrastructure is still a problem. It was definitely harder by the time the migration started affecting Brazil more severely, but it's still an issue that ADRA responds to, especially with UNICEF, as it really affects most severely the children and the shelters, because the population still keep on coming. There's more and more of Venezuelans arriving to Brazil daily. What we see is that those spontaneous settlements and the shelters, the more structured or official shelters, if you will, that are put together, that were built to support those arriving to Brazil, they will never grow in a rate or in the same, just as fast. I mean, the infrastructures to provide safe water and so on would never be built as fast as the shelters and the spontaneous settlements would grow, you see? So it's unfortunate that the host communities face some of those challenges too, but the migrating populations definitely are in a more difficult situation in regard to access to water, to hygiene. And the thing is, it's obviously something good that when we provide assistance, when we provide the humanitarian response to the people migrating, I mean, the host communities would obviously benefit from the spillover effect of what we do. But there's still a lot more of needs affecting more severely the life of the Venezuelan population in Brazil. But when you go to different areas of the country, eventually they would go to, bigger urban areas, big cities in other states of Brazil, and they will probably have access to safe water there. The infrastructure is more available in other parts, but there is when they would be, obviously lacking livelihoods, and it will affect and cause issues in terms of the nutrition. They would be only eating what they are given, or the most accessible food, or the cheapest food that not usually is food of quality. Food insecurity in this sense is something that is generally affecting the Venezuelans throughout the country. In terms of protection, they will be facing different challenges in each part of the country, but it still is a general problem that we have in Brazil, that we know, problems that are affecting the Venezuelan population here in our country.
Andre, it certainly sounds like a huge undertaking to respond to all of the needs that you've been describing. And I'm sure that all that response requires a lot of collaboration given the complexity of the situation. Now, you mentioned working with the church and with local government. Can you explain more about how ADRA worked with local communities, such as these church and government entities, but also other local players, to strengthen its assistance towards the affected migrant population? And just as importantly, how has ADRA ensured that the wishes of the migrants are included in this response programming?
Oh, sure, Emily, I can speak on that. And I'm actually very proud to say that ADRA was one of the first actors to ever start responding to this migration in Brazil. And this reality put us in this favorable place, if you will, to build partnerships and develop a network with all the actors active in this humanitarian response that allow us to provide the more coordinated and the more holistic, complete assistance to the Venezuelan population in Brazil. When we started this work in 2018, it was with a relatively small project with the support of ADRA International, with OFDA funding, but just as soon as we got to the place, as we got to Roraima, UNICEF also reached out for us to support with hygiene services and hygiene promotion services, and hygiene kits distribution, food distribution. The assistance has taken many forms since we started this work, but all with the support of the local community. We always count on the Venezuelans also to inform us the design of our projects, and we will target the population according to the vulnerabilities that we identify with them. We are able to assess the most vulnerable or the most severely affected people with the support of the community. And the church, the Adventist Church, was an important actor as we started. Before we became a more structured response, there would be volunteers allowing us to enter the most remote communities. Volunteers would help us communicate with, for example, with indigenous communities that would be speaking different languages, not Portuguese, not Spanish. So we would have volunteers allowing us also to access those communities and allowing us to provide the appropriate assistance that they needed. Those partnerships and projects, they would allow us different kinds of assistance, and we use a lot of CBI, and by CBI I mean cash-based interventions or cash transfer programs, to provide either food assistance or hygiene assistance. We used to provide more of in-kind assistance, which we don't usually do anymore. We don't have to, but several of the community services that we started doing, especially with hygiene promotion, they are still in place. For example, with hand washing, orientation for children in schools, or the cleaning of community areas. Those are all things that we got to those were all responses or activities that we included in our projects as the communities informed us with their needs, and they are the main important part of our response, right? They are actively taking part in for example, in the cleaning of the community areas in the spontaneous settlements where they live. They are engaging in the education activities or the WASH education activities that we are offering in schools there in the north of Brazil mostly. But for example, when we talk about the authorities in one of ADRA's projects, this one funded by UNICEF, we monitor the quality of the water that is arriving, for example, in those spontaneous settlements or other kinds of settlements of Venezuelans, and we report monthly to the local competent entities so they can make the corrections, the adjustments, and the improvements in the infrastructure or in the treatment of the water, just to ensure that it is safe for the Venezuelan population to consume. And again, I think those are all activities that are not benefiting only the migrating population, but like I said, the spillover effect of this humanitarian response is bringing improvement to the entire host community, as well as the infrastructures are improved, as the quality of the water is also improved, enhanced. I think this is important to highlight that we ended up creating this network, a very strong network. We created and now we act on a network that not only coordinates the response to ensure needs are met where they are, and we avoid duplication and so on, but we also created this network that allows us referral, of needs that we cannot met by our own resources or our own capacities. And we most recently, for the past couple of years, we've been putting together humanitarian fairs, as we call them, inviting humanitarian actors, agencies, entities, from the Brazilian government, from international institutions and other NGOs. They come to ADRA so we can offer in the same place, in the same day, at the same time, a lot of services, in topics of protection, wash, nutrition, food security. So Venezuelans, they can come to ADRA, and usually that's what happens. They will reach out to ADRA, and ADRA will just put together whatever service and whatever activity that we can to meet their needs, or eventually referring them to partners that we identified could meet their needs. It's just very impressive what we were able to achieve through this network work, if that makes sense. It's good to work in this kind of positive environment and partnership, and just focusing on the needs of the people that we are trying to assist. And one thing that is very important is that we are constantly changing our response to the needs that we identify. That the very profile of the population arriving to Brazil, it has changed since the migration started, and ADRA's work has adapted to that profile or to the different needs that the people arriving are facing. And this is this network that we developed. It is also being shaped by this approach that ADRA will use to say, look, partner, we have identified more of health needs, for example, more of protection needs, child protection, or other vulnerable groups are having their rights violated. We actually make sure that this network is also adapting along with ADRA to meet the current and the active needs of the migrating population. And the way that we've been used, or one of the main ways that we've been using to ensure that the affected population can really speak on their needs and they can inform those changes in our work, are several actually feedback mechanisms that we have in place, and to all of our offices here in Brazil and to all of our projects. They can really just make a phone call or text us through those communication apps. They can use our social networks, or I mean, they can reach out to our team. There are many, many ways that they can really speak to us. We are really interested in their opinion, which they can express through those feedback mechanisms that we have in place. Especially in Brazil, we call it canal de responsabilidade, or accountability channel, that they can really place complaints or give us positive feedback, make suggestions on what we could be doing better, and so on. Those mechanisms are very, very useful. But those were just one of the things. And our monitoring teams, the meal teams in our projects, they are also very active in carrying out post-distribution monitoring, or they go making verification visits, as we call them. They go house to house, asking people what they thought about our work, about the assistance that the assistance they received, and so on. Those are all efforts that we have going on day to day, just to ensure that we are informed by the affected population of their needs, and making sure that we are providing them with the most adequate, appropriate response, as they perceive it as so.
That is some really, really amazing work that you're describing. You mentioned that you were proud to say that ADRA was one of the first actors in this response, and I can certainly see why. It really does sound like ADRA Brazil has done some incredible work. So in that same vein, I would like to ask, at a personal level, what has been the most fulfilling part of your involvement in supporting migrants? And what have you learned that you think is important for other humanitarians who might one day work in similar contexts?
Oh, well, Emily, as you can see, even by my choice of words, I'm just the happiest man to be part of this work. Being with ADRA since 2019, it's really my pleasure to have been directly involved with the assistance that we are carrying out in this very intelligent manner, in this very human manner, filled with compassion and having love as a motive to everything that we do. Those are things that have been affecting me personally. I spent 2 years of my career with ADRA in Roraima, so I was coordinating one of our food security projects there. So obviously I was directly impacted by all that I would see on the ground, on the field, in terms of great challenges of the population that are migrating. But I have to say, it was hard. Those were not easy couple of years. But that was definitely the most rewarding experience of my life. I can say there's not enough of compassion and empathy that you can put out when you see the level of the complexity of the challenges and somewhat the sadness of the population that are forced to migrate. You see, it has led me to this most common conclusion. I think everyone will speak on this, but it's important to take nothing for granted. I've been really impressed by how most of the things that I knew as are considered obvious are not really obvious, are not really obvious to someone who is forced to eventually communicate in a language that you have never been in contact with. So nothing really is that obvious when you can even express what is it that you need. You can take nothing for granted when actually especially being a Brazilian person as I am, there are many, many things that I just kind of know because I observed, because I was taught in school, because I don't know, I watch it on TV, but as like imagine a refugee and someone from another country that was raised in a whole different culture, just arriving to this whole new place with nothing but the uncertainties of life ahead of them. It may sound cliche, but I was really impressed by that, and I think since then, a lot has changed in my personal life, of just observing the needs of the people just more deeply. And like I said, taking nothing for granted, it also has allowed me to see things in their own perspective, allowing me to communicate better what is available for them to have assistance in the country, and this cultural differences that eventually will create barriers. I think I learned a lot on how to go through them, and supporting people, also putting them down, putting those obstacles down. And obviously I know for sure that I have this work, and it's a work that I carry out with a lot of purpose. You are I don't think you can be the same person when you see changes so visible, happening as you work. I just love my work. I just love what I do. And being part of this humanitarian response to the migration, to the Venezuela migration, has a lot to do with it. It has brought me new perspectives, I think new professional possibilities even, and it still inspires me, to keep a constant effort to adapt. I think professionally and personally as well. So I think this is my personal experience with this whole work, Emily. If I can suggest anything to other humanitarian workers, I mean, that are listening to us, is this: just make sure that have your eyes open. Make sure that you are constantly adapting to the needs you find in place. It's important to try to walk in the shoes of the person you're trying to assist, as much as you can. It's something that it's a skill that any humanitarian worker should, to be trying to improve and develop more and more as their work continues.
It sounds like this work has been very life-changing for you. Andre, I want to thank you so much for sharing these experiences, these insights with us, as well as how this has personally impacted you. I know we've just touched the surface of this topic, and there's so much more that we could delve into. But I do want to thank you for what you've shared, as it really gives our listeners a deeper look into what things are really like there on the ground, working with migrant populations, as well as balancing that with the needs of host populations. Now, before we close, I would like to open this up. Is there anything else that you would like to share with our listeners that you want to make sure that they know? Maybe some additional advice, words of encouragement, anything. I know you've shared some advice already, but anything else that you would like to share with our listeners?
Oh yes, Emily. It's like you said, we barely touched the surface, and when we talk about the needs of the people, of vulnerable people and people forced to migrate, it's important to keep eyes open. I spoke a little on this again before, but I'll say that again. It's important to keep the eyes open, and it's in an open mind to realize that the needs are way beyond the surface. Even the people in need, they may find it difficult to acknowledge the emotional issues that they face, the abuses that they eventually are subjected to, the violence they go under. So those are things that we need to have our eyes open to feel up the willingness to adapt, like that I mentioned. It's the most important thing that I've learned in this since I joined the humanitarian work. We are talking about people, and we have our. I think any individual can acknowledge the complexities of their own mind and of their own lives. So it's important to have this empathy, for that people also that we are assisting. They may be now migrants, but that's not the whole definition of them as individuals. It's important to have them understand them as human beings, and therefore keep the eyes open to look beyond the surface, and just do whatever is possible, adapting as much as anyone can to provide what is needed at the moment beyond the material needs. Even like I said, there are emotional issues, there are psychological impacts of the migration. Those things may not be well communicated, but it's important to have compassion and be ready to do whatever one can to meet their needs as well.
If you would like to learn more about the South American migrant crisis, or if you would like to learn about other topics regarding health, nutrition, and WASH, feel free to contact the Health Technical Learning Lab at healthtll@adra.org. That's healthtll@adra.org to listen to other episodes of the HTLL podcast. Please find us and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. We also now have a Spanish channel for HTLL episodes in Spanish. To check this out, search the HTLL Podcast Espanol. Thanks for listening and join us next time for another episode on the HTLL Podcast.